People like to say first impressions last forever, but sometimes all it takes is one stormy night to prove that everyone was wrong. The first thing I learned after moving into my little blue house in a quiet Oregon neighborhood was that everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Before I had even finished carrying the last box inside, 3 different neighbors had introduced themselves, handed me homemade cookies, and warned me about the man living next door. According to them, Logan Bennett was impossible to please. He complained about barking dogs, overgrown hedges, loud music, crooked mailboxes, and even leaves that blew into his yard from someone else's tree. One elderly woman lowered her voice as though she was sharing a dangerous secret. "He is not a bad man," she said. "He is just exhausting." I laughed politely, assuming people were exaggerating. Every neighborhood seemed to have one resident who became the subject of harmless gossip. I was more concerned about unpacking my illustration supplies before my publishing deadline than worrying about an older neighbor I had not even met. The next morning I finally saw him. Logan looked exactly like someone who preferred quiet over conversation. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, with neatly combed light brown hair, showing the faintest hints of gray near his temples. He wore jeans, an old flannel shirt, and work gloves while trimming roses along the fence separating our yards. I smiled and waved. He glanced toward me, gave a brief nod that lasted less than a second, and immediately returned to clipping branches with complete concentration. "Well," I muttered to myself, "that was friendly." Over the following week, our interactions remained almost identical. Every morning I waved. Every morning, he answered with the smallest possible acknowledgement before continuing whatever task occupied him. One afternoon, I accidentally left my recycling bin halfway into the street after collection. Before I noticed my mistake, Logan quietly rolled it back beside my garage without saying a single word. The following day, he knocked on my door only to point out that one of my porch lights was flickering and could burn out. "Soon. You should replace it before the rain starts," he said. Then he walked away before I could even thank him. I could not decide whether he was genuinely helpful or simply incapable of having a normal conversation. By Friday afternoon, dark clouds swallowed the sky much earlier than expected. The local weather report warned of severe thunderstorms with wind gusts reaching 50 miles per hour. I hurried home after buying groceries, hoping to finish a few sketches before the storm arrived. Around 8 o'clock, the rain began pounding against the windows so loudly that I turned off the television because I could no longer hear it. Bright flashes of lightning lit the neighborhood every few seconds until suddenly everything went dark. The power had gone out. I searched my kitchen drawers for candles while the wind rattled every window in the house. Just as I managed to find a flashlight, someone knocked firmly on my front door. My heart skipped for a moment. Through the peephole, I saw Logan standing on my porch, completely soaked despite wearing a rain jacket. Water dripped from his hair onto the welcome mat, but his expression remained calm. I opened the door halfway. Before I could ask why he was there, he looked directly at me and said, "I know everyone probably told you to avoid me, but I could really use your help tonight." In that instant, every story I had heard about my annoying older neighbor suddenly became far less interesting than the quiet urgency in his eyes. For a few seconds, I simply stared at him while rain hammered against the porch roof and thunder rolled across the sky. Nothing about the man standing in front of me matched the picture the neighborhood had painted. He did not look irritated or impatient. If anything, he looked uncomfortable asking for help at all. I opened the door wider without thinking twice. "Come inside before you catch a cold," I said. Logan stepped into the entryway carefully, removing his rain jacket so it would not drip across the hardwood floor. "Thank you," he replied quietly. "I would not have bothered you if it was not important." I handed him a towel from the hallway closet while the flashlight resting on the kitchen counter cast long shadows across the room. "What happened?" I asked. He rubbed the towel through his damp hair before answering. "A large tree branch came down in my backyard. It did not hit the house, but it crushed the small greenhouse I built a few years ago. I cannot move everything by myself in this weather, and I need to rescue the plants before the temperature drops overnight." I blinked in surprise. "Plants?" Logan nodded. "Most of them are vegetables for the community food pantry and a few schools nearby. If they stay outside all night, they will probably be ruined." That was not the answer I expected. Nobody had mentioned that the supposedly grumpy neighbor spent his free time growing vegetables for people he had never met. I grabbed my rain boots and an old waterproof jacket hanging by the door. Then let us save your garden. A faint smile appeared on Logan's face for the first time since we met. It was small, almost hesitant, but it completely changed the way he looked. We crossed the narrow space between our houses while cold rain soaked our sleeves within seconds. The flashlight bounced across puddles as we reached his backyard. A thick maple branch had collapsed across one side of a modest greenhouse, cracking several wooden beams, but leaving much of the structure standing. Inside, rows of tomato plants, herbs, peppers, and lettuce leaned dangerously beneath the damaged roof. Logan immediately began lifting broken boards away from the entrance while I carried trays of seedlings toward his covered back porch. We worked without wasting words, passing pots back and forth with surprising rhythm. Every now and then Logan quietly thanked me whenever I rescued another tray before the rain reached it. Nearly 40 minutes later, the last plant sat safely beneath the porch roof. We both stood there catching our breath while rain continued falling beyond the edge of the awning. Logan looked over the rescued garden with visible relief. "You probably think I am ridiculous," he said with a tired laugh. "Most people would have waited until morning." I shook my head. "Not if those plants were feeding people." He looked genuinely surprised by my answer. After a moment, he disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying 2 steaming mugs. "It is only chamomile tea," he said. "The power outage means coffee is impossible tonight." We sat on 2 old wooden chairs overlooking the battered greenhouse. The silence between us felt unexpectedly comfortable. Eventually, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since moving into the neighborhood. "Can I ask you something?" Logan nodded. "Why does everyone think you complain about everything?" He stared out at the rain for a few seconds before smiling with quiet amusement. "Because complaining is easier for people to remember than helping." I laughed softly. "So all those stories were not exactly wrong." "No," he admitted. "I probably do complain too much." He looked down at the warm mug resting in his hands before adding, "I just never realized nobody noticed the rest." As another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the yard, I found myself wondering whether I had been introduced to the wrong version of the man living next door all along. The storm became the kind of story people talked about for weeks, but for me it was not the broken tree or the power outage that stayed in my memory. It was the strange realization that the man everyone had warned me about had thanked me more times in one evening than some people managed in an entire year. The next morning, sunshine returned as if nothing had happened. Fallen branches lined the streets. Utility trucks worked from one block to another, and neighbors stepped outside to inspect the damage with coffee mugs in their hands. I was carrying a box of flattened moving cartons toward my recycling bin when I noticed Logan already rebuilding one side of the greenhouse. He looked up briefly, set down his hammer, and walked over carrying a small paper bag. "These survived," he said, handing it to me. Inside were 3 bright red tomatoes and a handful of fresh basil. "Call it a thank you." I smiled. "You know I only helped because you asked." Logan gave a quiet shrug. "That does not mean I should stop being grateful." Before I could answer, he nodded politely and returned to his work. Watching him disappear behind the damaged greenhouse, I laughed to myself. The neighborhood had not been wrong. He was a man of very few words. They had simply forgotten to mention that every one of those words mattered. Over the next several weeks, an odd routine developed between us without either of us suggesting it aloud. If I noticed one of his porch lights had burned out while I was shopping, I picked up a replacement bulb. If Logan saw a package sitting outside my front door while rain clouds gathered, he quietly moved it beneath the covered porch. When I worked late into the evening finishing illustrations, I occasionally found a container of homemade vegetable soup waiting on my doorstep with a simple note that read, "Eat something besides coffee." I responded by leaving blueberry muffins outside his kitchen door one Saturday morning. Later that afternoon, I found the empty plate washed, wrapped in a clean towel, and returned with another short note. "Too much sugar." They were excellent. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my tea. Apparently, compliments from Logan always arrived disguised as complaints. One pleasant Sunday afternoon, I heard the unmistakable sound of frustration coming from next door. Curious, I walked outside and found Logan kneeling beside an old lawn mower that refused to start. Grease covered his hands, and several tools lay scattered across the driveway. "Need another pair of hands?" I asked. He looked up with an expression somewhere between annoyance and relief. "Only if you are prepared to witness me losing an argument with a machine." I sat beside him, holding a flashlight while he explained each part of the engine with the patience of someone who had spent years teaching complicated ideas to teenagers. That was when I finally asked about his job. "You teach history?" Logan nodded while tightening a bolt. "High school juniors. They pretend they hate it until graduation, then they send me letters telling me it was their favorite class." "That sounds familiar," I replied. "Children tell me they love my drawings. Adults tell me they love the stories years later." Logan paused and looked at me with genuine curiosity. "So maybe we both spend our lives helping people remember things that matter." It was probably the longest conversation we had shared since the storm, yet it never felt forced. By the time the lawn mower finally roared back to life, neither of us celebrated the repaired machine nearly as much as the easy laughter that followed. As I walked back across the narrow strip of grass separating our homes, I realized something had quietly changed. I no longer thought of Logan as the difficult older neighbor living next door. Instead, I had begun measuring my days by the small moments we unexpectedly shared, and somehow those ordinary moments had become the part of each day I looked forward to the most. By the time autumn arrived, the rhythm of our lives had settled into something neither of us ever talked about, yet both of us quietly depended on. Every morning, I opened my front curtains while Logan was already outside watering whatever vegetables happened to be in season. Every afternoon, he returned from school carrying a worn leather messenger bag that looked older than some of his students. Every evening, one of us eventually found a reason to wander into the backyard, and somehow the conversation always lasted longer than either of us expected. The neighborhood had also begun noticing the change. The same people who had warned me about Logan now smiled whenever they saw us talking over the fence. Mrs. Jenkins from across the street teased that I had accomplished something nobody else had managed in years. "He actually smiles now," she whispered one afternoon while pretending not to look in Logan's direction. I laughed because she was right. His smiles were still small and usually appeared without warning, but they had become much more frequent. One Saturday afternoon, I carried 2 fresh loaves of homemade bread next door after trying a new recipe. Logan opened the door wearing an old gray sweater with flour covering one sleeve. "Please tell me I am not interrupting dinner," I said. "Actually," he replied, stepping aside, "you are interrupting a complete disaster." I followed him into the kitchen and immediately understood. Smoke no longer filled the room, but one blackened baking dish sat abandoned on the stove while another tray of vegetables looked only slightly more successful. I held up the bread with a grin. "Good timing." Logan laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "You may have just saved the evening." We shared dinner at his small wooden table, trading my fresh bread for his roasted vegetables and tomato soup made from the greenhouse harvest. For the first time, I really looked around his home. It was tidy without feeling empty, comfortable without trying too hard to impress anyone. Bookshelves lined one wall of the living room, almost every shelf filled with history books, biographies, and well-worn novels. Framed photographs rested on a piano that looked as though it had not been played in years. Family vacations, graduation ceremonies, and smiling faces filled the frames, but one photograph caught my attention. It showed a much younger Logan standing beside an older couple outside what looked like a farmhouse. His smile in that picture was bigger than any smile I had seen since moving next door. Logan noticed where I was looking. He quietly picked up the frame before gently brushing away a layer of dust with his thumb. "My parents," he said. "They both passed away within 3 years of each other." His voice remained calm, but I could hear the weight behind every word. I stayed here after that because this house held every memory I had left. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence no longer felt awkward. It felt respectful. Logan placed the photograph back on the piano before continuing with a faint smile. "Most people think I complain because I enjoy being difficult." He shook his head gently. "The truth is that I spent so many years taking care of my parents that I forgot how to let people take care of me. Somewhere along the way, I became better at pointing out problems than accepting kindness." His honesty caught me completely off guard. I thought back to every container of soup, every repaired porch light, every quietly returned favor that had slowly become part of my life. "You know," I said softly, "you have spent months helping me with little things without ever making me feel like I owed you anything." Logan looked at me with quiet curiosity. Maybe that is because helping other people always felt easier than asking for help. I smiled, remembering the stormy night that had brought us together. Then I am glad the power went out. He looked toward the rain-speckled window, where the first autumn shower had begun tapping softly against the glass, and after a thoughtful pause he smiled again. So am I. In that simple answer, I realized the strongest walls were never built around houses. They were built around hearts, and little by little, without either of us noticing exactly when it happened, those walls had already begun to come down. Winter arrived gently, covering the neighborhood with thin layers of frost that sparkled beneath the morning sun, and somehow our quiet routines only grew stronger with the changing season. Every Saturday had become unofficially reserved for whatever project Logan happened to invent. Sometimes we repaired loose fence boards for elderly neighbors. Sometimes we carried boxes at the local food pantry where most of the vegetables from his greenhouse eventually found their way. Other weekends, we simply drank coffee on his back porch while discussing everything from American history to children's books. I noticed something interesting during those months. Logan seemed to know almost everyone in town by name. The cashier at the grocery store greeted him warmly. Parents waved to him whenever we passed the park. Former students often stopped just to tell him about college, new jobs, or families they had started. They all smiled when they saw him. It made me wonder how someone so respected by so many people had somehow earned the reputation of being the neighborhood's difficult neighbor. One snowy Friday afternoon, I walked home carrying a bag of groceries when I spotted a moving truck parked in front of Logan's house. My heart tightened before I could think logically. For one brief, irrational moment, I wondered if he had decided to leave without telling me. I hurried across the street, just as two men carried several large cardboard boxes from the garage. Logan noticed my expression immediately and laughed. "Relax," he said. "I am not disappearing." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "You could have warned me before parking a moving truck outside." His smile slowly faded into something more thoughtful. "Actually, I probably should have talked to you about something." After the workers left, we carried 2 mugs of hot coffee into the backyard despite the cold. Logan wrapped both hands around his cup before speaking. "Last week the school district offered me a position." I looked at him carefully. "Congratulations." He nodded, although his expression remained uncertain. "It is a department chair position." "That sounds like a promotion." "It is." He paused for several seconds before finishing the sentence. "But it is in Seattle." The words settled between us much heavier than I expected. Seattle was not across town. It was another state, another life, another routine that no longer included coffee on quiet mornings or shared Saturdays repairing greenhouses and lawn mowers. I forced myself to smile because that seemed like the supportive thing to do. "You have always deserved opportunities like that." Logan studied my face with the same careful attention he usually reserved for repairing delicate plants. "You are saying all the right words," he said quietly, "but you do not sound happy." I looked down into my coffee, watching steam disappear into the cold air. "I am happy for you." The words were true, but they were not complete. Logan leaned back in his chair. "The principal wants my answer in 2 weeks." Neither of us spoke after that. The familiar silence returned, but this time it carried something neither of us had experienced before. It was filled with uncertainty. Over the following days, our routines continued almost exactly as they always had. Logan still left soup on my porch whenever I worked too late. I still baked bread whenever I experimented with new recipes. We still talked over the fence every evening. Yet every ordinary moment suddenly felt strangely fragile, as though an invisible clock had started counting down towards something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. One evening, I found myself standing at my studio window watching Logan carefully cover his winter vegetables before another frost. I realized I was no longer imagining what life would be like with him living next door. Instead, I was trying to imagine the neighborhood without him, and no matter how hard I tried, the picture never felt complete. The following 2 weeks moved with an uncomfortable kind of normalcy, the sort that only exists when both people know a change is coming, but neither one is brave enough to speak about it again. Logan never mentioned Seattle, and I never asked whether he had made his decision. Instead, we continued living inside the quiet routines that had somehow become the foundation of both our lives. Every morning, I found myself looking toward his backyard before making coffee, expecting to see him checking the greenhouse or brushing frost from the raised garden beds. Every afternoon, his old pickup truck pulled into the driveway at nearly the same time, and I would casually find a reason to step outside, pretending I happened to need fresh air. Sometimes we talked for 20 minutes. Sometimes only 5. Somehow those brief conversations had become the part of each day that made everything else feel complete. One Saturday, we volunteered together at the local food pantry, just as we had done many times before. Families arrived one after another to collect fresh produce, canned goods, and warm meals prepared by volunteers from around town. Logan greeted nearly everyone by name, asking about children, grandparents, job interviews, and school plays with genuine interest. Watching him interact with people made something inside me ache in a way I could not fully explain. The neighborhood had spent years calling him difficult, yet here he was quietly carrying heavy boxes for elderly couples and making nervous children laugh by pretending carrots were magic wands. On the drive home, neither of us spoke much. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield while soft music played through the truck speakers. Finally, Logan broke the silence. Do you ever wonder how life changes so slowly that you barely notice it until one day everything feels completely different? I smiled faintly. Almost every day. He nodded without taking his eyes off the road. When you moved in, I thought you would wave at me for a week and then decide I was exactly the person everyone warned you about. I laughed quietly. You almost convinced me. He chuckled before growing thoughtful again. Instead, you kept showing up. His words stayed with me long after we arrived home. That evening I worked in my studio, but I spent more time staring out the window than drawing. My sketchbook remained open to the same unfinished page for nearly an hour. Eventually, I walked outside carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate instead of coffee. Logan was sitting on his back porch wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching light snow settle across the yard. I handed him one of the mugs before taking the chair beside him. For several peaceful minutes, we listened to nothing except the gentle sound of snow landing on wooden railings. The principal called again today, Logan said at last. My heart immediately tightened. What did you tell them? He slowly turned the warm mug between his hands. I asked for 2 more days. I looked at him in surprise. I thought you already had 2 weeks. I did. He smiled without much joy. Apparently, I needed 2 days more. I wanted to ask why, but something told me he was not ready to answer. Instead, I looked across the quiet backyard toward the greenhouse we had saved together months earlier during the storm. Even in the middle of winter, soft lights glowed inside, protecting the vegetables from the cold. Logan noticed where I was looking. Funny, is it not? He said softly. Plants survive because someone keeps showing up to take care of them every day. Miss enough days, and eventually they stop growing. I knew he was no longer talking about the greenhouse. Before I could find the right words, he stood and wished me good night with the same gentle smile that had become so familiar. As I walked back toward my own house, I suddenly understood the truth I had been avoiding for weeks. I was no longer afraid that Logan might leave because he was a good neighbor. I was afraid because somewhere between one stormy night and countless ordinary days, he had quietly become the person I could no longer imagine calling anything less than home. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the porch light glowing through the falling snow, the greenhouse standing quietly beneath its protective cover, and Logan's calm voice reminding me that living things survived because someone chose to keep showing up. By sunrise, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I stayed silent now, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had simply been honest. That afternoon, I finished an illustration for a children's book, but instead of feeling satisfied, I stared at the completed drawing and realized every picture I had created during the past several months contained the same quiet details. A small porch, a wooden fence, a garden, 2 people standing close enough to talk without raising their voices. Somehow Logan had found his way into my work long before I admitted he had found his way into my heart. Just before sunset, I noticed movement next door. Logan was carefully hanging a new bird feeder beneath the old maple tree that had lost its largest branch during the storm months earlier. I walked across the narrow strip of grass separating our yards before I could lose my nerve. He looked up with an easy smile. Perfect timing, he said. I was about to make coffee. I shook my head gently. Can we talk first? His expression immediately became more serious. Without asking another question, he set down the screwdriver and joined me beside the fence where our conversations had begun so many months before. Cold winter air surrounded us, but neither of us seemed to notice. I took a slow breath. Have you accepted the Seattle job? Logan looked at me for several seconds before quietly answering. No. Relief rushed through me so quickly that I almost laughed. Are you going to? He looked toward his house instead of answering immediately. I honestly do not know anymore. I nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. Then I need to tell you something before you decide. My hands felt colder than the weather itself. I had rehearsed dozens of speeches in my head, yet every carefully planned sentence disappeared the moment I looked into his eyes. What remained was the truth. When I moved here, everyone warned me about you. Logan smiled faintly. I remember. They told me you complained too much, that you wanted to be left alone, that you were impossible to know. I laughed softly. They were wrong about the important part. He watched me silently. Somewhere between saving your greenhouse, drinking coffee on your porch, fixing lawn mowers, delivering soup, and spending ordinary Saturdays together, you became the person I look for every morning. My voice trembled despite every effort to stay calm. I kept telling myself I was only afraid of losing a good neighbor, but that is not true anymore. Logan's eyes never left mine. The truth is that I care about you far more than I ever expected to. I do not know what tomorrow looks like, and I do not want to pressure you into staying if Seattle is where your future belongs. I only know that you deserve to hear how I feel before making that decision. Silence settled between us once again, but this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt honest. Logan slowly stepped closer until only the fence separated us. He rested one hand lightly on the top rail and smiled with a warmth I had never seen before. Do you know why I asked for 2 more days? He asked quietly. I shook my head. His smile grew just a little wider. Because I realized I was waiting for the same conversation. He let out a small breath that sounded almost like relief. I stopped seeing this as just a neighborhood a long time ago, Mason. Somewhere along the way, it became the place where you were. My heart felt impossibly light. Logan looked toward the softly glowing windows of our 2 houses before meeting my eyes again. I have spent years believing that every important chapter of my life was already behind me. He smiled with quiet certainty. Then one stubborn young illustrator moved in next door and kept waving until I finally looked up. At that moment, I realized the storm that had first brought us together had never really been about the weather. It had simply been the beginning of 2 lonely lives finally finding the courage to face each other instead of the rain. The following morning, the neighborhood looked exactly the same, yet everything had quietly changed for us. The fence between our backyards was still standing. The greenhouse still caught the first rays of sunlight. The old maple tree still stretched across both properties. But when I stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee, I no longer wondered whether I should walk next door. I simply did. Logan opened his back door before I even reached the porch. You are early, he said with a smile that no longer seemed hesitant. You are complaining already, I answered. He laughed, accepted the coffee, and for the first time I realized the neighborhood had been right about one thing. Complaining really was his favorite love language. 3 days later, Logan called the school district and declined the promotion in Seattle. When I asked whether he regretted the decision, he thought about it for a long moment before shaking his head. A promotion changes a career, he said. The right people change a life. Those words stayed with me through the months that followed. Spring slowly returned to Oregon, bringing fresh rain, blooming gardens, and another season inside the greenhouse that had started everything. We settled into a relationship that felt surprisingly natural because its foundation had never been grand gestures. It had always been ordinary days. We still cooked dinner together several nights each week. We still volunteered at the food pantry every Saturday morning. I continued illustrating children's books while Logan continued teaching history with the same patience his students admired. Sometimes I visited his classroom after school to sketch while students finished projects, and watching them gather around his desk reminded me why he had never really belonged anywhere else. They respected him because he listened before he spoke. One afternoon, a former student stopped by carrying a wedding invitation. After Logan congratulated him, the young man smiled at me before whispering with a grin, "He smiles a lot more now than he used to." Logan rolled his eyes in mock annoyance. Apparently, everyone has become an expert on my face. I quietly squeezed his hand beneath the table after the student left, maybe because they finally have something worth noticing. Summer arrived with long evenings that seemed determined never to end. We repaired the greenhouse completely, replacing every damaged beam left from the storm that had first brought us together. When we finished, Logan stepped back to admire the work. "It looks better than before," he admitted. I looked at the sturdy new frame and smiled. Some things do after they survive difficult weather. He knew I was talking about far more than wood and glass. A few weeks later, Mrs. Jenkins wandered across the street carrying a pie. She looked from me to Logan before pretending to sigh dramatically. I knew this was going to happen the moment I saw the two of you arguing over tomato plants. Logan laughed. We were not arguing. No, she replied with a knowing smile. You were falling in love while pretending to discuss gardening. We both laughed because there was no point denying something that had become so obvious. As autumn approached once again, we decided to remove a small section of the wooden fence dividing our backyards and replace it with a simple arched gate. It was nothing elaborate, just enough to walk between our homes without going around the front. The afternoon we finished installing it, Logan rested one hand on the new gate and smiled thoughtfully. Funny, he said. For years I believed fences existed to keep people out. I gently pushed the gate open until it swung freely between our yards. Maybe the right ones simply remind us there is always a way through. He stepped across first, then looked back at me with the same quiet warmth that had changed my life on one unforgettable stormy night. Without another word, we walked together toward the greenhouse, carrying fresh seedlings for another season. Both of us finally understanding that the strongest home we would ever build was never going to be made of walls, roofs, or even neighboring houses. It was always going to be built one ordinary day, one shared tradition, and one open gate at a time. 5 years passed more quietly than either of us ever imagined they would. People often say that life changes through unforgettable moments. But I learned that the happiest chapters are usually written through ordinary mornings repeated often enough to become a lifetime. Every day still began with coffee on the back porch. Logan still insisted that I use too much cinnamon whenever I baked. I still reminded him that no one else in Oregon could turn a simple conversation about watering tomatoes into a lecture about American history. Some traditions never disappeared, and neither did the laughter that always followed them. The greenhouse had become larger than either of us originally planned. What had once been a small wooden structure rescued during a storm now supplied fresh vegetables to several local food pantries and school programs throughout the county. Every spring, dozens of Logan's students volunteered to help prepare seedlings, and every summer neighborhood families gathered for community harvest days that somehow always ended with homemade pie and far too much coffee. Watching children race between the garden beds while their parents filled baskets with vegetables reminded me that kindness, like gardens, quietly multiplied whenever people chose to care for something together. My own career had grown as well. The children's books I illustrated found readers across the country, and more than once publishers asked whether the gentle neighborhoods and warm gardens in my stories were inspired by real places. I always smiled and answered yes, although I never explained that nearly every porch, fence, and greenhouse I painted had begun with one quiet man who believed complaints were easier for people to remember than kindness. Logan remained exactly the teacher everyone needed him to be. Former students still return years later carrying graduation announcements, wedding invitations, and photographs of growing families. Some visited simply to thank the teacher who had convinced them history was really just the story of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Every time I watched one of those conversations, I silently remembered that Logan had once believed his most important chapters were already behind him. He could not have been more wrong. One autumn evening, almost exactly 5 years. After the storm, dark clouds gathered once again over the neighborhood. Thunder echoed softly in the distance while rain began falling against the greenhouse roof. We stood together beneath the porch, listening to the familiar rhythm of water tapping against the wooden steps. Logan looked toward the old maple tree, now healthy again after losing its largest branch years before. "Do you remember that night?" he asked with a quiet smile. I laughed softly. "The night everyone expected me to avoid my annoying neighbor?" He shook his head with playful disbelief. "I cannot believe that reputation lasted as long as it did. It disappeared the moment you knocked on my door asking me to save tomato plants." He smiled before slipping his hand gently into mine. "Best decision I ever made." Rain continued falling across the backyard, while warm lights glowed inside the greenhouse, protecting another season of growing vegetables just as they had all those years before. I realized then that our lives had quietly come full circle. The storm that once seemed like an inconvenience had become the beginning of everything that truly mattered. If the power had never gone out, if that tree branch had never fallen, if Logan had decided his pride was more important than asking for help, we might have remained nothing more than polite neighbors living on opposite sides of a fence. Instead, we built a life from shared meals, quiet mornings, repaired gardens, open gates, and countless ordinary days that slowly transformed strangers into family. Sometimes people ask me whether I believe first impressions last forever. I always smile before looking toward the porch where Logan is almost certainly reminding me that my coffee has been sitting too long. Then I give the only answer my life has ever proved to be true. First impressions may introduce a person, but kindness, patience, and the courage to keep showing up are what truly tell the story. And every time rain begins falling across our little corner of Oregon, I silently thank one unforgettable stormy night for changing my life forever.